Welcome back. We're drinking strawberry mango seltzer and reading Plato. Book 6 today. I'm glad you made it. There are so many ideas in Book 6 of Plato's Republic. I certainly considered doing episode 6.1 and 6.2, but then I realized that even that wouldn't do the whole thing justice. Justice. So what I'm going to do here is just hit the 2 or 3 key takeaways from this chapter in hopes that I make you want to read or even reread it. It certainly bears rereading. Okay, but anyway, we skipped books 3, 4, and 5, and that's not because they're not any good. But in those chapters, there was a lot of discussion about the guardian class, about the noble lie. The Straussians love talking about the noble lie. And some more on the idea of individual justice and the tripartite soul. Here's PewDiePie's summary of what seems like most of the first half of the books of the Republic.
And maybe you were thinking, well, finding the definition of justice, that's really not that interesting. At least first, when I heard about it, I wasn't completely engaged. But when you think about it in a broad sense, it really shapes everything in our lives. What is good, what is bad, what is right and wrong. Is being just better than being unjust?
When you really think about it, guys. All right. So anyway, we're in, and then finally in book 5, which again we skipped book 5. Socrates and Glaucon and Adeimantus, they distinguish between the philosopher and the non-philosopher. And the distinction is very important, but really difficult to understand. And I'm going to tell you why it's difficult to understand, and then probably just leave it at that. The reason that it's difficult to understand the distinction between the philosopher and the non-philosopher is that you probably think you're a philosopher. And this is kind of always the problem, isn't it? Whenever we make a distinction like a hierarchical distinction, we go, this guy's up here and this guy's down here, and then the only people who want to understand it think that they got to be the up here guy. So basically everybody, and like I said, certainly everybody who studies this and this point carefully and then accepts it is probably going to think that they're one of the more noble sort. And even in Socrates' day, as Adeimantus points out, the philosophers seemed, to the masses, ornery and generally useless. And so there is the question, why should they rule? But Socrates says, no, I love this. He just basically goes, those aren't the real philosophers. And frankly, like I said, I really do love that because I think he's right. I mean, I think that it's easy to call yourself that and put it in your Twitter bio and even get like an undergraduate degree in it. But that's not what a real philosopher is, at least according to Socrates. And even if you want to use different language, his distinction here, I think, makes sense. So, according to Socrates, most men love what he calls sights and sounds. They trust their senses, and they delight in their senses, and the pleasures provided by their senses, as an end in themselves. Okay? The philosopher is different. He doesn't get lost in those weeds. He hardly has attachment to the things of the senses. Instead, he focuses all his attention on what Socrates calls forms. I think the word in Greek is eidos, and it's sometimes also translated as ideas. We're going to go into this a little bit today, but I mean, it's frustrating because you could do a whole graduate seminar just thinking about the forms. And it's very hard to explain. I'm not a genius at it either. It kind of confounds me sometimes. But this is also the part where you might have to admit that you're not a philosopher. Or it's the place I might most likely be able to get you to admit that. Okay? So, and I mean, I could go into I'll skip the digression for now. If I have time at the end, I'll throw some more in about this. But here's my set piece. Ever go to the grocery store and stand in the apple aisle and look for some good apples to take home? Of course, everyone has done that. Now, most people, especially salt-of-the-earth people, these no-nonsense types, they sort of walk down there, pick their apples out. They go, if you ask them about it, they go, I know what I like and can't nobody change my tastes, And that's that. And if you could somehow slow down one of these non-philosophers and insist that they explain their method for choosing apples, they might finally utter something like, I like the bright red ones that look juicy. or I like the green ones that are tart, or whatever, right? Or they might mention any number of other criteria. But pause for a second here and really think about what your own criteria are for choosing an apple. You might like them to be bright in their color, to not have too many freckles, or to have a good texture. I mean, you have a criteria in your head, right? A certain taste. These are all sort of criteria. But this isn't really how a philosopher goes through the apple aisle. In his mind, he's trying to recollect, remember. And this is a key word. He's trying to remember a dim memory, literally from the other world, from the world before he was born. It's literally a memory that's fading. He's trying to remember a perfect and eternal apple that he once beheld before his soul incarnated in a body. Wow. Now you go like, what? Like, do these things even exist? These eternal, perfect apples? Like, this seems, what do you think? This sounds kind of ridiculously supernatural or something, right? But each of these apples that actually sits in the grocery store, according to Socrates, so the word he likes to use is partakes. So each actually physical apple partakes of the form of that eternal apple, or of the idea of that eternal apple. And to the extent that it partakes of that form, it approaches perfect appleness. What's interesting here, I mean, just to digress a little, like you can, if I say to you, like, picture a perfect apple, so you're going to picture an apple, right? I mean, or even if I just said picture an apple, you would probably picture a perfect one. Would you, in your head, would you start picturing an apple with like a dent taken out of it, or a brown spot, or, not ripe enough or something? Like, we don't generally do that, right? So it seems like our minds are sort of calling us to the perfect apple. Picking out a good apple is essentially a physics question, meaning it happens in the physical world. But thinking about what makes an apple good is a metaphysical question, right? The question gets even more interesting, by the way, in, for instance, Plato's Parmenides dialogue, where Socrates is asked by the older man, by Parmenides, whether all things have their form, or their idea, right? For instance, does beauty and truth and justice? Of course, says Socrates. And then Parmenides says, and what about things like man and woman and home? Do they have a form? And Socrates says, for certain, And then Parmenides says, okay, but what about lesser things like hair or mud or tree bark? Or I can't remember his other examples. I mean, mud. It's hard to picture like ideal mud, isn't it? Or like the form of mud. Like what is mud approaching? It's not perfect yet, but it could be perfect mud, right? Eventually, Parmenides kind of confounds Socrates. It's the only dialogue, by the way, where someone other than Socrates pulls a Socrates on Socrates. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, it's like Socrates is the one left in the state of aporia there. Aporia is that state of like sort of confusion and disorientation and unknowing, right? Which is what Socrates then sort of goes on to become famous for. I know that I do not know. So if you were to observe a no-nonsense, salt-of-the-earth non-philosopher in the grocery aisle, zip through there and pick out 3 competent red delicious apples before moving on to the salad aisle, and then observe a philosopher literally wringing his hands, possibly even closing his eyes as he tries to recollect something from the eternal realm, and perhaps even eventually moving on to the salad aisle without even picking up a single apple. If you observe these two, you can see why the world's judgment of the philosopher is always negative. he seems to the world to be a distracted stargazer. He seems like his head is in the clouds. But that is because he's trying to understand the idea of the many things, and not the many things themselves.
Plato claimed that particulars participate in or instantiate the forms, that the form is somehow present within the particular which possesses it.
And one form could be instantiated by many different particulars.
Plato thought that it was for this reason that we were able to recognise things that are different as somehow being the same.
And this is important, right? Like, there's a reason for this theory of the forms. It's not just for fun. I mean, the problem is, like, and I remember there's a Borges story called Funes, or His Memory. And it's about this guy who had one of those perfect memories. I can't remember who it is, but there's this Hollywood actress that has this. Like, they literally can tell you, like, what they did on, January 23rd in 1988 or something. And so the story is about that guy, and that guy, he's got too much memory, basically. And part of the problem is he can't understand why the rest of us mortals all use the word dog for, he says, for a dog seen at 3:15 in profile, and the same word dog for this animal seen head on at 3:16 p.m., right? Like, in other words, why do we use the same word to describe dog when it looks completely different seen from the side as it does from the front or something? Well, why not just have different words for them? But see, like, it's because we, the mortals, we all refer up to the form. We start to see in our mind's eye, having looked at 100 apples, we sort of see the average of apple, and we start to put together, like, the best of all of those apples in some way. And like, what it leaves us with is, in our imaginations, a thing toward which we hope that apples will grow. I used to be completely fascinated by this idea of like the theory of forms in relation to what is it called? Like genetic engineering, basically. That's not the word for it. What did they use, like, in the, like, hybridization, like trying to grow a good watermelon vine, or a pumpkin, or a certain kind of a dogwood tree or whatever. And so, or a dog. Like, this is the most interesting with dog breeds. Like, for instance, like, think of the Doberman, okay? Like, the Doberman, I mean, all the dogs come from wolves. But once they start to break off, they start to branch into different breeds. And I think this happens, like, either accidentally or because some dogs seem to be better at doing certain things or something. But then it's like, how do these breeders, what are they driving toward? Like, how do they select in each generation, in each litter, the one that will reproduce in the next generation that somehow will be an even more ideal Doberman, right? And when you think of this, it's kind of mind-blowing. Like, did someone, like, I don't know how long ago the Doberman was sort of first imagined, right? But, like, at some point, it wasn't too different from either a wolf or some, or like a German Shepherd or whatever the proto-dog was there, right? But then someone had in their mind's eye, they were like, we need to actually make it more, I don't know, like pointy-faced and thinner and meaner and whatever. And it's like, They had this list of criteria, and it was only in their head that criteria existed. And then after many, many dog breed generations, you finally arrive at something like a Doberman, I guess. I mean, theoretically. And it gets really weird when you start thinking of something like, the English Bulldog or something. Like, how could that be an ideal of anything? Anyway, sorry to digress so long, but this is a really interesting idea. This is also important for thinking about something like beauty, right? Like, I mean, people get mad about this, but in terms of human beauty, for example, it's, I mean, there are people who will argue that, like, the beautiful face is just the face that most approximates the average of all faces or something like that. And maybe that's true. I mean, but in any case, I guess the point with it is that the form of human must exist somewhere in order for us to make judgments about each individual particular human being. And if you don't have the form to refer to in your head, you can't judge one more beautiful than another. I guess that's the idea here. So here's another example. Think of how your shadow is sort of derived from your body, but it's always only a rough approximation of your body. Imagine if someone, some genius, some artist, was only allowed somehow to see your shadow, but tried from observing your various shadows in all their long, stretched out and compacted and warped shapes to sort of deduce, to reverse engineer what the actual you, the body itself, must be. Wouldn't that be an incredible project? To try to just look at all your shadows and then sort of figure what it must look like in the third dimension. That is sort of what Socrates is referring to here. And that's an analogy for how the philosopher thinks of the forms. Look, I've already blown like 10 minutes and we haven't even touched book 6 yet. The point is, you need to do some homework on understanding the forms, but once you've understood it, and then come back to book 6, where Socrates begins by assuming that we've distinguished between philosophers who keep their mind's eye always on what is unchanging and eternal, on the forms, and the non-philosophers who are distracted by incidental shapes and sounds and sights. What philosophers are sort of not so good at is keeping up with the small and changing stuff. Okay, that's the problem with philosophers. For instance, philosophers don't watch this.
Coming up this season on The Bachelorette.
I'm a grown woman. I do what I want to do when I want to do it.
No, thank you, right? Because philosophers are like, I saw this last season. Who cares? I mean, I don't need another example of, that. And the same goes, by the way, for something like, this.
Now reporting, George Stephanopoulos.
Good afternoon. We're coming on the air now with breaking news in the killing of George Floyd, who died on Memorial Day. There you see him right there.
Don't care, right? Not because I'm mean or anything, but because I'm a philosopher. Like, that's the idea. I've heard this story before. I've heard it when it was Trayvon Martin or, Emmett Till or whatever. I know it sounds crude, but that's the way that a philosopher tends to think. And to prove it to you, I will cite now Henry David Thoreau, America's best philosopher. Listen to what he says about how a philosopher thinks.
If we read of one man robbed or murdered or killed by accident, or one house burned, or one vessel wrecked, or one steamboat blown up, or one cow run over on the Western Railroad, or one mad dog killed, or one lot of grasshoppers in the winter, we never need read of another. One is enough. If you are acquainted with the principle, what do you care for a myriad instances and applications? To a philosopher, all news, as it is called, is gossip, and they who edit and read it are old women over their tea.
And no offense to old women over their tea, but they aren't philosophers, okay? Here, Socrates asks, quote, "Since philosophers are those who are able to grasp what is always the same in all respects, while those who are not able to do so but wander among what is many and varies in all ways are not philosophers, which should be the leaders of a city?" End quote. And here, let me remind you one more time that all of this is an analogy for personal and individual justice. So the question is really, or at least also, should your governing self, should the ruler within you, your logos, your highest reason, should it be a philosopher? That is, should it be attached to sensation and anecdote and particular? Or should it be the part of you that sees what is universal and eternal? Okay? You got that? This is your last reminder on the fact that, like, even though we're about to talk about the state a lot, we're really talking about what he established in book 2, which is, the self. And the question of justice within an individual. Okay, so the philosopher, quote, has no taste for falsehood. They are completely unwilling to admit what's false, but hate it while cherishing the truth. He must, quote, from youth on, strive as intensely as possible for every kind of truth. And he must also forsake those pleasures that come through the body if he isn't a counterfeit but a true philosopher. And he will not love money. And okay, here is where Adeimantus breaks in and says, Socrates, a person like this is useless to a city. And it's a good challenge. I mean, honestly, like, I've met some of these guys, like, in their mid-20s in graduate school in philosophy or, liberal arts. They can be pretty useless, right? Like, they just are they have that messy haircut and their stupid jeans and, like, it's like, okay, yeah, you're always thinking about Schopenhauer or whatever, but you're not. Why is this guy qualified to govern us? And Socrates answers with such a great analogy. I am like a connoisseur of analogies. Analogies, reveal the mysteries. The Christian Bible calls them parables, right? I'm going to do a whole episode on the Iliad and similes. I love the way that you can use these. You can kind of leverage, you can, use them as what do they call that? A leap off, stepping stone. If you get really into the parable. And Socrates is great at this. Of course, book 7 is that whole giant metaphor of the cave, right? And so here's another one. So listen to Socrates use an analogy to make his point about why philosophers should rule. So he says, I'm going to have to, he says, I'm going to bring this image together for you as painters paint goat stags and such things by making mixtures. Okay, quote. Conceive something of this kind happening either on many ships or one. Though the ship owner surpasses everyone on board in height and strength, he is rather deaf and likewise somewhat short-sighted, and his knowledge of seamanship is pretty much on the same level. The sailors are quarreling with one another about the piloting, each supposing he ought to pilot, although he has never learned the art and can't produce his teacher or prove there was a time when he was learning it. Besides this, they claim it isn't even teachable and are ready to cut to pieces the man who says it's teachable. And they are always crowded around the ship owner himself, begging and doing everything so that he'll turn the rudder over to them. And sometimes, if they fail at persuasion and other men succeed at it, they either kill the others or throw them out of the ship. Enchaining the noble ship owner with mandrake, drink, or something else, they rule the ship, using what's in it. And drinking and feasting, they sail as such men would be thought likely to sail. Besides this, they praise and call skilled sailor, pilot, and knower of the ship's business, the man who is clever at figuring out how they will get the rule, either by persuading or by forcing the ship owner, while the man who is not of this sort they blame as useless. They don't know that for the true pilot it is necessary to pay careful attention to year, seasons, heavens, stars, winds, and everything that's proper to the art if he is really going to be skilled at ruling a ship. And they don't suppose it's possible to acquire the art and practice of how one can get hold of the helm, whether the others wish it or not, and at the same time to acquire the pilot's skill. So, with such things happening on the ships, don't you believe that the true pilot will really be called a stargazer, a prater and useless to them by those who sail on ships run like this? So, I hope you get the analogy, right? I mean, this is the advanced class, I guess. I mean, the idea here is, who should rule? And there's this quiet guy sitting on the side of the ship looking out over the ocean, not worried about the question who should rule, because he's figuring out where we are in the sea and whether a storm is coming and so on. And that makes it very unlikely that he's going to get elected or chosen to lead, but he's your guy. He's the guy who ought to be ruling, right? Sometimes people don't love this because they, like democratic-minded people don't like this because they don't think there are such people. They don't think certain people are born to rule. But that's what the philosopher is, according to Socrates. Philosophers know how to steer. And they know how to steer because they keep their eye on what is unchanging. They probably don't watch the news or even vote. They take the 10,000-foot view on everything. They know that aristocracies degenerate into oligarchies and there's nothing you can do about it. They know that democracies turn into tyrannies and there's nothing you can do about it. But they do know this. They know where we are in the long cycle of civilization. And that helps a little bit. Socrates then goes on to totally slam the sophists. That is, the teachers, basically. I mean, that's the modern equivalent, I guess. The teachers and professors. It's basically like, or news pundits, too, for sure. Those would all be sophists. And, sorry, let me see where I am there. And again, these people have no convictions, right? They inflict this view, even with threats sometimes, eventually, on everyone. So, as a result, very few men can endure all the false teaching and bad incentives that are sort of thrown at them for, 18 years of public education. Very few will attain the view that a philosopher must attain. Socrates again uses a great analogy to make this point. I'm going to read it to you again. Let's see. So, blah, blah, blah. If anything should be saved and become such as it ought to be in regimes in this kind of condition, it won't be bad if you say it's a God's dispensation saved it. Yes, that's the right thing. Okay, then he goes like this. Ready? That each of the private wage earners whom these men call sophists and believe to be their rivals in art educates in nothing other than these convictions of the many, which they opine when they are gathered together, and he calls this wisdom. It is just like the case of a man, here's the analogy, ready? It's just like the case of a man who learns by heart the angers and desires of a great, strong beast he is rearing, how it should be approached, and how taken hold of, when, and as a result of what, it becomes most difficult or most gentle, and particularly under what conditions it is accustomed to utter its several sounds, and in turn what sort of sounds uttered by another make it tame and angry. When he has learned all this from associating and spending time with the beast, he calls it wisdom, and organizing it as an art turns to teaching. Knowing nothing in truth about which of these convictions and desires is noble or base or good or evil or just or unjust, he applies all these names, following the great animal's opinions, calling what delights it good and what vexes it bad. He has no other argument about them, but calls the necessary just and noble, neither having seen nor being able to show someone else how much the nature of the necessary and good really differ. Now, in your opinion, wouldn't such a man, in the name of Zeus, be out of place as an educator? Whew, man, that is so good. You should really rewind that and listen again, because it's such a good analogy for who shouldn't be educating. I had this friend in graduate school he called himself a sophist. I knew a lot of guys in grad school who were into sophistry. They hated Plato, and they were into sophistry and argument and prattling, basically. But they did it in this, they thought they were somehow better than Plato. It was absurd. And I remember went over to this guy's house one time, and he had at least 2 dogs that when you would walk in his front door would just jump all over you. And it was the kind. You ever go to these people's houses? I mean, right as soon as you step in the door, this dog puts its paws up on your middle chest and starts barking and stuff. And it's like, dude, you have to train your dogs. Do you know that? But he's like, no, he's sweet. He'll be fine. Just ignore him for a couple minutes and he'll settle down. And it's like, you've let the dog be in charge of this house. Like, you've done it backwards, right? And this is what Socrates is saying about the philosopher and the masses. That someone like the sophists basically takes the masses' stupid opinion and shills for it, or caters to it. Whereas a philosopher doesn't care about the opinions of the masses. He's too busy keeping his eye on the stars. So back to my lecture, I guess. So while the city, like a bunch of idiots that it always is, and yes, this is the Platonic view. You might be offended if you're like a hardcore, like kind of democratic-minded person, but come on, you guys, most people are kind of not philosophers. That's all I'm saying, right? So while the city, like the bunch of idiots that it always is, prefers, Donald Trump or Obama or Jared Kushner to lead them, the actual philosopher will probably be some anonymous video game playing loner loser whose own mother thinks he amounts to practically nothing. Okay? And that's Socrates' view. Listen to these interesting paragraphs. He says, what do you suppose such a young man will do in such circumstances, especially if he chances to be from a big city, is rich and noble in it, and is further good-looking and tall? Won't he be overflowing with unbounded hope, believing he will be competent to mind the business of both Greeks and barbarians, and won't he, as a result, exalt himself to the heights, mindlessly full of pretension and empty conceit? Indeed he will, Glaucon answers. And Socrates continues, now if someone were gently to approach the young man in this condition, and tell him the truth, that he has no intelligence in him, although he needs it, and that it's not to be acquired except by slaving for its acquisition, do you think it will be easy for him to hear through a wall of so many evils? Right? In other words, nobody wants to be told they're not a philosopher, and least of all, the, good-looking, verbally articulate, strong-jawed youth, right? Now, they do continue on this question of, well, will anyone survive all of the brainwashing that public school inflicts on them? The opinions thrown at them by the masses and so on. And yes, there will be some. So let's see. Socrates says it's a very small group which remains to keep company with philosophy in a way that's worthy. Perhaps either a noble and well-reared disposition, held in check by exile, remains by her side consistent with nature for want of corruptors, or when a great soul grows up in a little city, despises the business of the city and looks out beyond, and perhaps a very few men from another art who justly despise it because they have good natures might come to her, to philosophy. And the bridle of our comrade Theages might be such as to restrain him, for in Theages' case all the other conditions for an exile from philosophy were present, but the sickliness of his body shutting him out of politics restrains him. And then Socrates says, my case, the demonic sign, isn't worth mentioning, for it has perhaps occurred in some one other man and no other before. Skipping a little bit. He says, taking all this into calculation, he keeps quiet and minds his own business. This is the one philosopher left in your little town. As a man in a storm, when dust and rain are blown about by the wind, stands aside under a little wall. Seeing others filled full of lawlessness, he is content if somehow he himself can live his life here pure of injustice and unholy deeds, and take his leave from it graciously and cheerfully with fair hope. And there are, and then he goes on to talk even more about, like, how will we educate these few survivors? Like, once we somehow locate them in their mom's basement playing video games, what should we do? So there's the question, in what way, this is a quote, in what way, and as a result of what studies and practices the saviors will take their place within our regime for us, and at what ages each will take up each study. And this gets really interesting in this book because he's talking about, when they should learn things like geometry and grammar and what kinds of exercise they should do. Here's another quote. This nature, the philosophic young man, this nature must be tested in the labors, fears, and pleasures we mentioned then. And moreover, what we passed over then but mention now, it must also be given gymnastic in many studies to see whether it will be able to bear the greatest studies, or whether it will turn out to be a coward, as some turn out to be cowards in other things. And I mean, there are so many interesting examples here. He also, I think, at one point says that the guy eventually shouldn't, it's, what does he say? Anyway, basically they should almost try to fool him. They should send him to public school, basically, and see if he falls for it. It's crazy. Then you'll know by the fact that at the end of that, he still doesn't buy the party line. He still doesn't fall in with the majority. That's your guy. I mean, that's the one, right? If he can also, run a 7-minute mile, and he's good at geometry, and he's figured out the grammars and all that stuff. Okay. I said, time permitting, I might go back to that question of appleness. I remember one time I got into a little controversy almost thinking about this when I was talking. The example that came to my mind was those old black and white 1950s beauty contests. Before it was Miss America and she was supposed to have, a bachelor's degree in something and save the whales. It was just a beauty contest. And the question was kind of what is beauty, basically? What are we judging it on, right? And the same would go for what is justice or something like that. And what Socrates thinks is that the idea of beauty is it's already in our minds. It's a memory in our minds already from before birth or something. In other words, it's not something we've learned. Whereas, most of us in the, have seen those Dove commercials or something, where we live in the world where they try to convince you that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, or beauty is a social construct or something like that. For Plato, for Socrates, not at all. I mean, actually, it's a very real thing, but the real thing is beauty itself, and not the many particulars of it. And this is a really interesting question because it leads you to start to think about think of whatever, some beautiful woman, some celebrity woman or something that you've lusted after. And if you take her as the example and you look at her across her career, I mean, you could try to locate where was she most beautiful? On what day of her life did she peak in terms of physical beauty? But ultimately, that's a sort of a weird thing to think, right? Is beauty just it ripens on a certain day in your early 20s or something like that? And ultimately, what Socrates thinks is that that's because all incarnate things, all what does he call them? All instances or all particular examples of the form miss the form. None of them quite hit the mark. Every example, if you try to draw a circle, it won't be a perfect, geometrical circle because the table you're writing on is uneven, your hand is shaking, friction on the paper and the pencil. You can never really draw a perfect geometrical circle, and yet in your head, that circle exists. And for Socrates, that is the real. And we are just suffering in the world of illusion and avatars and various instantiations that aren't the ideal. They aren't the form itself, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense, right? So the next time you go to the grocery store, what you want to do here to really get into the idea is to try to look at the apples, but try to examine your own tastes and wonder, where do they come from? Where do my tastes come from? Again, going back to my idea of like the farmers who 10,000 years ago started hybridizing various fruits. So if you go back like 10,000 years and you find the original banana, the first banana, the wild banana, it would have been a little 3-inch thing full of seeds, barely edible. But some genius 10,000 years ago got it in his head that if we pick the best one of them in every generation and replant them and keep our eye on that and then pick the best one from the next generation, like 10,000 years from now, this thing might be a foot long and hardly have any seeds in it and, ripen over the course of 9 days. And it's like this perfect fruit now, right? And that's because we've been working it toward the ideal form. And in Socrates' mind, the magic here is that the ideal form of a banana existed already even 10,000 years ago. And that like humans have kind of been bringing it to fruition. Something like that. Isn't that an amazing, what a thought. I hope I did it justice. One other note for this episode, I did go back and find an old, not any fallen out of copyright, old 1896 recording of that part of Handel's Messiah that I used as the outro music for the first 4 episodes before switching it the last one. I'm going back to it. So we're going to keep that part. I think it's part 7 of the first part of Handel's Messiah or something. So that's what you get for the end of this episode. I hope it sounds good to you. See you next time when we do Book 7 of Plato's Republic. Man, the cave. You've heard of it, but man, you're not as in love with it as I am. Okay, talk to you next time on Godward Podcast. Bye.